Welcome again to this webinar, which is to coincide with the launch of this book, our Guide to Regulating Stimulants. My name's James Nichols. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Transform Drug Policy Foundation. Transform is a UK-based charity that advocates for an end to prohibition and for drug policy that protects public health, human rights and social justice. Transform also runs the Anyone Child campaign, which is a campaign that brings together families from across the world who've been impacted by drugs and who now campaign for legal regulation as the only effective way to reduce harms. And you'll be hearing from Ray Lakeman, who's a Anyone's Child campaigner shortly. We also work in partnership with Mexico Unido contra la Delincuencia, an organization based in Mexico City, which has played a leading role in influencing drug policy in that country. And you'll be hearing from MUCD's director, Lisa Sanchez, shortly as well. MUCD helped fund the book, and there will be a Spanish launch of this book next year. So that's going to be great when that's ready to go. As I say, this webinar is to coincide with the launch of this book, How to Regulate Stimulants, a Practical Guide, which is the first, as far as we're aware, full-length analysis of how to establish legally regulated markets for cocaine, MDA and stimulants. A huge amount of work has gone into this book, and I'd like to thank, before we begin, everyone at Transform who's contributed, our donors. We had over 150 people contributed to our crowdfunder for this. The many external experts who commented on the text, Tim Barnes, who designed it, Halo Media, who did the mock-ups of the packaging. It's been a huge collective endeavor, and we're really, really proud to be able to launch this to the world this week. And we hope that, well, what we really hope is that it moves drug policy debates forward, not least by clearing new ground in what is a particularly difficult, and as I'm sure will be said later in the webinar, not overlooked, but very difficult to deal with, and so underrepresented, I suppose, area of drug policy reform, which is reform around stimulants. I will introduce our panel in a moment, but firstly, just a little bit of housekeeping. If you have thoughts or you want to upload links, please do so in the chat channel. As I said, just check that your chat settings are set to attendees and panelists so everyone can see what you have to say. You're welcome to do that, and we will also be posting links onto that channel, as will the speakers, or they're free to do so if they want to. If you have questions for the panel specifically for the Q&A, please put that into the Q&A box. So click on the Q&A for questions to the panel. We really want this to be an interactive session. We want to get as many voices heard, as many questions asked as we can. So do, at any point, if you have any questions, put them in the Q&A, and we will endeavour to answer as many of those as possible. The webinar is being recorded, and it will be available on YouTube hopefully in the next few days. You can watch it again, or tell your friends and colleagues that they can watch it later as well. Please stick around. Just at the end, we'll have a quick feedback form. I know these things can be a bit tedious, but it's really, really invaluable for everybody. If you could fill that in when that comes up right at the end of the webinar, we'd really appreciate that. And if you want to tweet, and please do tweet, we have a hashtag, which is going to go into the chat channel, I think now-ish, which is hashtag regulate stimulants, all one word. So if you could tweet with that hashtag, it'd be great. Okay, our panelists for tonight are going to, we have panelists from around the world. We're going to have, you're going to hear from Ray Lakeman, who's a long-standing member of our Anyone's Child campaign. You're going to hear from Gloria Lai, who's the Regional Director for Asia for the International Drug Policy Consortium. From Lorenzo Uribe, who's a master's student at the Harris School of Public Policy, the University of Chicago, and who was an advisor to the Colombian Green Party Senator Ivan Marulanda, and worked on the cocaine regulation bill that's going through the Colombian Parliament at the moment. You're going to hear from Lisa Sanchez, who's the director of MUCD, who I mentioned before, and from Steve Rolls, who's a senior policy analyst here at Transform, and also the lead author of the book. Everyone's going to speak for around 7 or 8 minutes. That's a short amount of time, but people are going to try and get as much in as they can, followed by responses to your questions. In the questions and answer, we'll be also joined by Adria Cots-Fernandez from the International Drug Policy Consortium, who can field questions relevant to the IDPC's work. As I say, do put questions in the Q&A channel, and any links or general comments in the chat. So that's enough from me. Without further ado, we're going to go into our first speaker. So we're going to first, as I say, hear from Ray Lakeman, who is an Anyone's Child campaigner whose personal journey has led him to support the kind of regulation that is outlined in our book. So I'm going to hand over now to you, Ray.
All right. Yeah, my story. It's about my sons, actually. I had two sons, Jacques and Torin. They were born about 15 months apart. And they grew up together here on the Isle of Man, which is a lovely place. They did all kinds of things together. They played football, swam, sailed yachts, all kinds of things. All the kinds of things is the kind of lifestyle that you'd like to bring your boys up in, any children up in. They were good musicians. They were very talented. And for 18 years, they were together. They didn't do very much. Then Torin went off to university, and Jacques went across to London to get some work, because it's seasonal work, the sort of things that he was doing. And they arranged to meet up on the 29th of November 2014 to watch a football match in Manchester, because they were great Manchester United supporters. And they went along to the football match. And I'd arranged to meet Jack a few days later in London. And I did actually get to see him, but he wasn't in London. He was actually on a mortuary slab in Bolton, lying alongside his brother, Torin. It turned out they bought some MDMA on the black dark web, taking it while they were in Manchester, and it killed them both. And I didn't even know that Torin was interested in drugs. I knew that Jacques had dabbled a little bit, but I didn't have a clue about Torin. He always seemed to be totally against drugs and things like that. Anyway, within a few days, everything was cleared up, and we had the cremation. Some of his friends came up from university, and one thing struck me straight away was we were talking about it, and they were thoughtful about it. They were obviously very sorry. They obviously thought a lot of my son, but they were talking about drugs, and what they were saying is that he was unlucky. They wanted drugs to be made safer. And that came up similarly in the inquest about 5 months later, when somebody actually said to me, during the inquest, the pathologist, the coroner, and everybody, they were talking about this MDMA dose that they'd taken, and they were talking about a regulation drugs dosage, something that they knew could be actually safe. And I thought, well, my boys are going to take this. They're obviously going to take it. You know that there is a safe dosage. You know that this can be made safe, and yet it's illegal. We're not going to stop. You know, the kids were saying they're going to continue taking drugs. They want them to be made safe. And it was an eye-opener to me. I thought, well, how are we going to stop this in the future? I talked to my boys about taking drugs in the past, and it was quite clear that that message hasn't got through. I could tell them how dangerous it was. In fact, the more I think about it, if I'd have told my boys their own story, they would probably have said, well, yeah, that's what happens to other people. That doesn't happen to people like us. But it does happen to people like us. It does happen to people like them. It does happen to families like ours. And I want to change that. I don't want families to go through the things that my family's been through. And since I've learned, so many other families are going through. Since my boys died, there's been something like 25,000, 6 years ago, something like 25,000 people over here have died from using Class A drugs. And most of these things were preventable. I don't want people to take drugs, but I'm pragmatic about it. In fact, I've learned a lot about why people actually do it, why young people do it, and it worries me. We've got the pandemic and things, but it is young people. It's young people who are experimenting, curious, uh, and people. What the authorities need to understand is why they're taking it. I think I've come to understand that one of the reasons why Torin did when he was first at university was he was a bit lost. He was a bit lonely. He'd come from the Isle of Man. He was in accommodation. He didn't know people, and he was a bit confused. And somebody gave him something that helped him fit in, that made him feel good and confident. And people need to understand why people are using these drugs. I was listening to the radio this morning, and they were talking about cocaine use amongst women, and the deaths have gone up there. And they were saying, you know, the reason why women in particular are using, or using cocaine or anything, is depression. It activates them. It makes them. It's not just a party drug anymore. They're actually using it as medication, and the authorities need to know that that is what is happening. These people are not just fun-loving, pleasure-seeking people. Yes, they exist, but most of the time, they're self-medicating, and we need to treat it as that kind of an issue, as a health issue, and not as a criminal issue. And I think the more we understand this, the authorities need to understand it. I've come to understand it, and to me, it's quite obvious. And the more I speak to people, and I do speak to a lot of young people in particular. I went to a funeral of a young guy who died from heroin last year, and again the same thing was there were all young people there, and they were turning around and saying, "Well, we know that he's died. We know that he took drugs," but nearly everybody there had taken drugs and were going to continue taking drugs. We have to try to make it as safe as we possibly can. It's a horrible thing to say. I'm not advocating it, but we need to be pragmatic about it. And I don't want anybody to go through the same thing that I've been through, other families have been through, and will continue to go through while the government turns a blind eye and insists that its policies are correct and are working. It's ridiculous. How on earth can policies be working when year on year it's proved that they're worse? Deaths are going up, everything, deaths are going up, criminality is going up, crime is increasing, drug purity is increasing, violence is increasing because it's all supplied by gangs. And the Home Office repeatedly says the government has no intention of changing the legislation. If it was any other issue apart from drugs, the number of deaths, which I think now exceeds the number of deaths on the road, certainly in the UK, the number of deaths, people talking about that, they would turn around and say, change the law. This is ridiculous. But where drugs are concerned, it seems to be a completely different matter. But it's not. It's a completely different matter. And we need to change it because, every day, every week, there are more families who suffer the way that I have. My boys weren't bad boys. They made a mistake and their deaths were preventable. Had that drug been regulated, they would have taken a regulation dose. And so would the same with so many other people that we're losing. And to me, it's criminal, it's reprehensible, irresponsible of the government to carry on with the same policies. It breaks my heart every time I hear somebody else has died because it is preventable, and they're not doing anything about it.
Thank you, Ray. Listen, Ray, and I just want to say, and I want to echo what a lot of people are saying in the chat channel right now, which is to thank you so much for continuing to share your story and for your bravery and the articulate and moving way in which you make this case. It's incredible. And if you're not seeing in the chat, I just want to let you know that you've got so many people just saying thank
Yeah,
you.
I can see some of them. Thanks.
So thank you from everyone for
It's
that.
very gratifying, actually.
Yeah, no, it's just hugely appreciated. So thank you so much, Ray. It's an incredible thing that you're doing, and it's hugely appreciated. Okay, we're going to move on to our next speaker. As I say, we can ask questions at the end. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go to a video which has been made for us by Gloria Lai. Gloria is the Regional Director for Asia for the International Drug Policy Consortium, and she's talking about the situation around amphetamines, particularly in Asia. So we're going to go to that. It's a video. So if you just bear with us a second, the video should upload imminently. So thank you.
So good evening, everyone. I'm Gloria. I'm the Regional Director for Asia for the International Drug Policy Consortium. First of all, congratulations to Transform for the launch of this exciting publication on the legal regulation of amphetamines. And we hope it goes on to stimulate more dialogue about the need for alternative responses to amphetamines. And particularly in Asia, I have just a few slides here, but really the story of methamphetamine over the past 1-2 decades is really just one of escalation. It's a market that just keeps growing. It's one of the first or second largest market for methamphetamines in the world. And analysts, when they look at this and kind of see why do we keep seeing kind of climbing volumes of seizures, they would attribute it to the sophistication of transnational crime networks that operate here now. The fact that it's highly profitable, it's made out of chemicals that are cheap and they're available in large quantities, particularly in India and China. The methamphetamine that's here is often made in areas that are conflict zones in Myanmar that border China and in Thailand especially, and the ability of law enforcement in the region to try to stop or prevent the flow and the production, just they haven't been able to do that well, and unfortunately a lot of the law enforcement resources have had the largest impact on people most vulnerable and at the lower end of the supply chain. The next slide I actually wanted to show you was around data from the UN Office on Drugs and Crime. It just really shows this kind of sharp rise in the quantity of seizures in China and Southeast Asia, particularly in the last few years. It's something that hasn't stopped with COVID. So in terms of production and trafficking of both the drugs and the chemicals that are used to make them are still at record levels. And the price has dropped to the lowest level in a decade. In terms of government responses, it's something that we've tried to capture with some breadth, I guess, with a report that we released last year on the 10 years of drug policy in Asia. And in it mentions, in particular, some of the most extreme kind of policy responses that we might see today around the world in response to drugs. Most of the countries in the world that still keep the death penalty for drug activities are here and in Southeast Asia, particularly like Singapore, Indonesia, Vietnam, and China, of course. The killings that have happened in the Philippines in the thousands upon thousands by police and unidentified assailants started a lot from this campaign against drugs that the current president started waging from 2015, 2016. And amongst the drugs, the one that he most demonized was shabu, or methamphetamine. He claimed that people who use methamphetamine, that their brains melt and they are no longer human, so they don't need to be kept alive anymore. So there's really a lot of work that needs to be done to improve understanding about methamphetamine. These very punitive policies in the region includes the criminalization and the severe punishment, not only for possession, but for consumption alone. And as a result, you see in most prisons in the region, more than half are held for a drug offense. And that proportion is even higher for women. In Thailand, for example, over 80% of women in prison are held for drugs. And most of them are mothers, which is an indication of their caregiving role and the fact that many women held for smuggling drugs do so because they are poor and they need to provide for people who depend on them. The punishment comes in the form of criminalization, but also administrative punishment. And there's an extensive range in the region. One of the most prominent is the use of drug rehabilitation centers. So if you are caught using drugs in most countries in Southeast Asia and in China, you'll be taken by police, or even before that, your parents might take you to a drug rehabilitation center. And if they're run by government, more often than not, it's a detention center. You're not allowed to leave when you want. And conditions in there can be similar or even worse than prisons. We do see work being done by some civil society and community groups in the region to educate people, provide harm reduction information and services for people who use methamphetamine. So Charisma, who work in Jakarta in Indonesia, is an example of this. And their key message is about calling people who use methamphetamine to remember to eat and to drink water, and to make sure that they get enough sleep. And it really just highlights how simple harm reduction can be when it comes to methamphetamine. And for this region, I think we still have a long way to go in understanding how to appropriately respond to drug use and dependence issues. In terms of legal regulation for IDPC, we released 20 principles for the responsible legal regulation of cannabis in September. And of course, it's specific to cannabis, but a lot of the principles there are quite relevant for amphetamine as well, in particular when it comes to protecting the human rights and ensuring the availability of harm reduction for people who use methamphetamine and other stimulant drugs, making sure that in the whole supply chain that there is a social justice approach taken to ensure that communities are involved, and that even those operating at smaller scale have a chance to have a role in the market, so that it's not just dominated by large corporations. Also importantly, that people who have suffered under the previous prohibitionist criminalization and punitive model for amphetamine type drugs, that they receive some type of compensation and reparation for what happened to them before. I think also important to know around environmental sustainability, given the problems associated with all the chemicals that are being used, like for example, careful disposal of those chemicals used in the production of stimulant drugs. Also calling for a gender-sensitive approach to legal regulation of amphetamines. So this resource, of course, is available on our website, and we invite you to take a look at it, as well as many other resources there. And thank you for having me, and also our colleague Adria Kotz Fernandez, who helped prepare this resource. He'll be joining you live today to answer any questions on this. So best wishes for the event and good night.
Okay, well, that's great. Thank you so much. Gloria, I assume, is hopefully asleep because it's about 3 o'clock in the morning, I believe, where she is. So, but we're sending our thanks to her. Maybe Adria can pass that on as well to Gloria for that. That's a great presentation and just an amazing kind of terrible situation for people that people are facing out there, but some great work as well being done on the harm reduction front. So. Okay, we're going to move on now to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Lorenzo Uribe, who is a master's student at the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago. He was previously economic advisor to the Colombian Green Party Senator Ivan Marulanda. And so as part of that role, played a key role in drafting the cocaine regulation bill that's currently being debated in the Colombian Senate. He's going to tell you about that bill now, which is the first of its kind in the world, and it's really fascinating. So without further ado, Lorenzo, over to you.
Thank you, James, and thank you, Transform, for this invitation. I'm very happy and glad to get the chance to tell you a bit more about this bill that is currently under discussion in Colombia. As you mentioned, this is probably the first time that the bill aims at regulating all stages of the cocaine market in Colombia. So first, in the next 8 minutes, I would like to tell you a bit more about why we did this, what are the motivations behind these projects, the context. Then I would like to explain you what it is inside, what you have in the bill, and then tell you a bit more about what our expectations and what we hope to achieve with this. So to start, give you a bit of context about Colombia. As you know, Colombia has been one of the countries, if not the main country, affected by the war on drugs. This has brought immense suffering to Colombian people. So not only has it been a failure, but it has also brought a lot of suffering. It has failed because the production of cocaine keeps increasing. To give you an example, between 2008 and 2018, the production increased by 120%, despite all efforts to eradicate coca plantations. But it has also brought a lot of suffering too. Thousands of people die each year because of the wars on drugs. It costs billions of dollars to the Colombian state. We have an estimate that between 2005 and 2014, the money spent on coca eradication policies in Colombia, for example, was equivalent to 50 years, a bit more actually, than the annual budget of agriculture in Colombia. It has also brought very problematic consequences in terms of environment. It has, for example, contributed to 24% of the deforestation in 2017 in Colombia, which is one of the most biodiverse countries in the world. And it, as in Asia, as they were telling us, it has also brought a major, it has been also a major source of prison overcrowding. So around 30 to 40% of people in Colombia in prisons are jailed because of drug-related crimes. That's more or less like jailing arresting around 9 people every hour. And last but not least, and this is actually the main reason why Ivan Marulanda, the senator behind this bill, decided to present it, it has brought a lot of political instability and fueled corruption in the country. And this is where the macro context meets the personal life. And I think if it wasn't because of this personal story that Senator Marulanda has, this would not have happened. The story, to be brief, is the following. Ivan Marulanda has been in politics for the past 50 years. In the late 80s, he founded a party called Nuevo Liberalismo with another man called Luis Carlos Galan. And their main flag was to fight the influence of drug cartels in Colombian politics. And because of that, Luis Carlos Galan, who was the presidential candidate for that party and who was about to win the election, everyone knew he was about to win the elections, got murdered by drug cartels, including Pablo Escobar, a few months before the election. As a result, Ivan Marulanda retired from politics, and it's only in the past 2-3 years that he decided to return with this idea of regulating the cocaine market. So 30 years ago, he was fighting against these drug cartels and their influence in politics. Now he feels that the only way to solve this problem is through the regulation of cocaine, which is the main drug Colombia produces. So what do we have in this bill? This bill can be divided into three big parts. And here I want to thank Transform, because actually the conceptual framework for this bill was in part thanks to Transform, who gave us all these insights. So here we are proposing a 3-tier regulation. In the first set of regulations, we will cover low potency or non-psychoactive products, such as the coca leaf itself, or beverages, food, cosmetic products based on the coca leaf. And these products will be subject to lighter regulation, similar that those already in place for similar products such as coffee. The second type of regulation would cover psychoactive products derived from the coca leaf, such as cocaine, that are used for recreational purposes. In this type of regulation, consumers will have to go through a medical checkup and register in a database before being allowed to buy a certain dose of cocaine in registered pharmacies. And of course, all type of advertisements and sponsoring will be forbidden, and only adults will be allowed to purchase cocaine. And in the third type of regulation, we will cover psychoactive products derived from the coca leaf that, due to their health consequences, will remain prohibited for sale. So such as crack cocaine. So in this case, it would not be criminalized, like you can consume it and you won't be criminalized, but a harm reduction strategy will be adopted and the government will not be selling these products. That's on the consumption side. On the production side, the idea is that the harvest of coca plants will be authorized only in certain areas. These areas are the areas where coca is currently being grown, as long as they remain outside of the environmentally protected areas. The reason to restrict the coca plantation to the current areas where there is coca, where there are coca plantations, is to make sure that these new market benefits the communities that have been most affected by the war on drugs, and to prevent new actors to enter. And transversal to this, to all these, and I think this is very important, there are special provisions for indigenous communities. Because in Colombia, as in other Andean countries, indigenous communities have had a long tradition with coca plantation, coca leaf, and this is something that we acknowledge in the bill. So last, to tell you a bit more about what we expect to achieve with this, we know the chances that this bill passes are very low, and we don't expect it to pass in the next couple of years, but we wanted to put the topic in the agenda. I think in Colombia at least, and in many parts of the world, many people acknowledge that the war on drugs has failed, but very few people actually give a concrete proposal of what we should do. And I think here is where Transform plays a key role with coming up with a concrete proposal, which is the one that we have proposed here. This bill has been signed and supported by more than 20 congressmen of 8 political parties. So even though we don't think it's going to pass, there is a strong support for this bill. And actually, people have received this bill with a lot of sympathy. And to conclude, I think what I want to say is that, as Transform said, this is the, I think I have to finish. Just to say that I think here is where like ideas like Transforms meet like concrete proposals like ours, and I think this is like the big value added of Transform, where we can actually move from the diagnostic to a concrete proposal. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lorenzo. It's such a fascinating piece of proposed legislation, and the journey that you describe as well, from one of taking on the cartels to proposing regulation, and that move from a kind of, as you say, laying out the problems to trying to define some solutions, and seeing that actually happen in real time is great and fascinating to hear about. I'm sure we'll have lots of questions about that. Okay, we're now going to move on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Lisa Sanchez. Lisa Sanchez is the director of Mexico Unido contra la Delincuencia, MUCD, a long-time partner of Transform. Under Lisa's leadership, MUCD have been doing incredible work in Mexico around drug policy, and hopefully be able to get a flavour of that in the short time that Lisa has. But I'll move over to her so she can speak to that for herself. So Lisa, over to you.
Thank you so much, James. Thank you so much to the Transform team, not just for the long-time partnership, but for these particular books and tools that I'm sure everybody present in this webinar agrees helps us move drug policy reform forward in lots of countries that have different problems. So, so far we've heard about the problems that prohibition causes for people who use drugs, countries that are mostly consumers of illicit substances. We've heard also what are the damages and the negative impacts that prohibition has on producer countries. Lorenzo shared the story of Colombia and all of the negative consequences the drug war had for the people, for the growers, for the people that use drugs, but also for peace, security, rule of law. And it is the case of Mexico, which is a transit country for cocaine mainly, and it's also one of the transforming countries and producer country of other stimulant illicit drugs that are being illegally trafficked to the United States. As part of this global chain and market for illicit drugs, we also suffer most of the consequences the drug war brings with it. We've been seeing an increase in lethal violence that is totally unacceptable. We've seen ever since the war on drugs was declared in Mexico in 2006, we have seen the homicide rate triple. We have seen an increased number of human rights violations. We have seen a crisis that's a crisis of overcrowded prison that's been fueled by criminalization, as Gloria said, is happening in Southeast Asia, of use and possession, because our drug laws are incredibly unfair and are actively targeting users instead of targeting the big criminals. But we have also seen an increase in illegal use of these particular substances. So what I want to talk to you about is what does the cocaine trade and market means to a country like mine, that it's just a transit country, and why is it important for us to have these resources, such as this book, to actually advance drug policy reform? So first of all, what the cocaine market means to Mexico. Well, cocaine is the second most consumed and persecuted drug in the country, just after cannabis. But although the cocaine use in the last year, for example, which is one of the most relevant indicators, or the past month, only represents 0.8% of all Mexicans from 12 to 65 years old, cocaine possessors and users represent 17% of the total of adults that actually had been prosecuted for drug offenses and were charged with simple possession. It also represents 6.3% of all the minors that had been charged with drug offenses and had been prosecuted for possession within the criminal justice system in Mexico. The same thing happens when you actually go and see what are the numbers for incarcerated people for drug offenses. And at the federal and state level here in Mexico, 23% of the total amount of the people that are behind bars for violating our drug laws are actually there and were incarcerating for cocaine offenses, mostly for cocaine possession in very small amounts that actually don't exceed $30 or $50 each. Cannabis, of course, still represents the majority of the drug crimes that had been committed in Mexico, with 61% of the incarcerated people. But still, cocaine, despite of the fact that Mexico is not a producer country, is actually concentrating quite an enormous amount of our drug enforcement activities and the criminalization against drug users that we're enforcing through those laws. Just to give you a very quick overview of what's the size of this market, according to the Mexican government, the cocaine illicit market in the country is worth around $345 million a year. It involves a lot of public resources that are being spent in enforcement actions, and in particular in militarizing drug operations and drug enforcement actions. And in average, every single year, Mexico seized around 10 tons of cocaine, either in throughout the territory or airports, ports, and also in the sea. Although the quantities that we're seizing are significantly lower than those registered in previous governments, for example, in the past government that ended in 2018, we in average seized 10.5 tons per year. And in the previous one that ended in 2012, the average was 19 tons per year. And before that, 23 tons per year. These quantities are still particularly high, and most importantly, they're relevant to us in the agenda of drug policy reform because they are squeezing very scarce public resources, and they are directing these very scarce resources into enforcing laws that are mostly affecting people who use drugs and people that are possessing very small quantities of drugs. This is particularly relevant for the entire Latin American region because, as Gloria said, that it happens in Southeast Asia. There is a human rights component to that, but there's also a gender dimension of these drug wars that is targeting actively and it's punishing very unproportionately women who are forced into trafficking small quantities of drugs. And all of our prisons in all of our countries are actually filled with women that had no other choice or that were forced by gender reasons to enter into this trade without the possibility of ensuring a decent livelihood recurring to other activities. So knowing that this is a problem to us because we don't use as much cocaine as other countries, but we actually suffer the negative consequences of the cocaine trade and the cocaine prohibition, what we have been doing at MUCD and with other local partners from Mexico and the region, such as Instituto RIA or Échale Cabeza in Colombia, is to advocate for drug policy reform. And our goals in this advocacy work that also includes education, public opinion efforts, and strategic litigation, which is I'm going to give a little more detail in a few seconds, is to promote a different and an alternative policy that actually minimizes the risks and the negative impacts and maximizes the potential upsides of having a regulated market. So long story short, and this you know because you've read most of the Transform material, what we're looking for is to have a safe safe policy that promotes and improves public health, because we understand drug policy and we understand drug efforts primarily as a public health issue, also in producing and transit countries as a human rights and social justice issue. We're promoting ways to reduce harm. We've heard the stories of the people that are using these substances without knowing the quantities, the dosages, and the potential risks to their health and lives. We want to distinguish between the harms caused by consumption and the harms caused by drug policy itself. And we also want to improve security. We want to reduce crime, corruption, violence. We want to defend the most vulnerable groups in our populations, particularly attending the needs of women, young people, children, and growers. And we want to defend and ensure the full exercise of human rights, which is basically what we are doing through most of the actions that we've been taking in Mexico to promote drug policy reform. So other than the traditional work that most of our organizations do, which include advocacy, public opinion, citizen diplomacy at the international level, most of the people that are connected to this webinar also go to the Commission on Narcotic Drugs of the United Nations or are involved somehow in regional discussions within the European Union or the CARICOM or the Organization of American States, what we also do is to defend and to promote strategic litigations. What we do is that we create landmark cases for the legal system in Mexico to analyze and have rulings that can advance the cause of drug policy reform, but also that can enhance our understanding of what does it mean to have or to adopt a human rights approach to drug policy. We started doing this with another organization called SACE back in 2012. We started promoting cases on cannabis consumption, basically saying or arguing that cannabis prohibition was unconstitutional because it allowed the state to defend just one way of living and one way of being healthy, which was not using drugs, and involved a very harsh prohibition on cannabis that basically forced cannabis users to go to the criminal market, to the black market, to ensure their consumption. And we also argued that that particular model that the state was enforcing into everybody, or was imposing to us, was also in a very an intrusive way for the government to be part of our private lives, and that what we wanted was to give to have a permit that the health authorities would issue, so we as users could grow our own cannabis, harvest our own cannabis, use our own cannabis privately without the intention to sell it. And we basically convinced the Supreme Court back in 2015 and got the first ruling that declared cannabis prohibition unconstitutional. Fast forward to that, in 2018, we finally got the jurisprudence that we needed in order for the court to order the Congress, the Mexican Congress, to legislate in our favor and regulate entirely the market from production to consumption, something that should have happened already, but because of the elections first, and then because of the pandemic, the Supreme Court has has extended the deadline for that to happen till the end of this year. But using those precedents, using that particular strategy that we use with cannabis, medicinal cannabis, that we basically won in the Supreme Court, we also started defending some cases on cocaine use. Based on the same premises that it's unconstitutional for or laws to absolutely prohibit access to these particular substances, forcing citizens to incur in crime, but also forcing citizens to live in a particular way in which the state is being quite intrusive and limiting the rights for people to express themselves and develop their own personality without harming third parties. We won that particular case on cocaine last year within a first level court, and two of our cases have now reached the Supreme Court. One, we actually withdrawn the case from the Supreme Court because the ruling was negative. They were not going to give us a permit, and we were not going to win the case. But we actually took it to the Supreme Court, as Lorenzo said, to make this conversation a national conversation, to speak about this issue, to educate decision makers about the real risks of cocaine, the risks of cocaine prohibition, and the risks of not regulating a substance and enhancing the power, not only the economic power, but also the firepower of criminal organizations in Mexico that are actively undermining security, the rule of law, and human rights. There are two more cases that are also at the Supreme Court. We don't know yet what the ruling would be, if the ruling is going to be positive or negative. But once we know exactly what's in that ruling, we will make the decision to whether withdraw the case or actually going forward with it, just to have this conversation. I think that the experience that we in Mexico have had with strategic litigation and advocacy work in advancing drug policy reform has been instrumental for other jurisdictions to learn, but also to educate our decision makers. Today, not even the worst prohibitionists in Mexico agree with the fact that drug use itself should be criminalized and people put in jail just for their use. They're more open to harm reduction at the moment, and they're more open even to the idea of regulating markets in order to reduce the harms that prohibition causes and reduce the harms that the war on drugs as a political choice and a political approach causes to countries like ours. So I just want to thank Transform, because as Lorenzo said, we use blueprint for regulation, tools for debate, how to regulate cannabis, and now we're definitely going to use how to regulate stimulants. All these materials to provide evidence for our cases, to educate the public, and of course to continue this conversation in targeted messages in our advocacy work to advance drug policy reform. So thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much for inviting me, and particularly for the amazing work you guys do.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you so much for that. And thank you for that amazing overview of the work that you're doing in Mexico, which is a real just kind of case study in how to effectively advocate and how to effectively use the tools at your disposal to have a real impact on policy and culture and the way in which people think about drug policy. So it's amazing work, and I'm sure people have questions about that towards the end. Just before we go over to Steve, just a reminder to everyone, we're getting some great questions in the Q&A. Do put your questions there, we will try and get to them all. But next up, and finally, our last speaker is going to be Steve Rolls, who many of you will know. Steve is a senior policy analyst here at Transform and lead author of the book, How to Regulate Stimulants. So Steve, without further ado, tell everyone how we're going to resolve this problem.
Thanks, James. Yeah, so I wanted to also, before I start talking about what's in the book, I did want to thank James, who is one of my co-authors, and I'd also like to thank Harvey Slade, who's my other co-author, who isn't with us tonight. I think he's watching, and the Transform team, who've been amazing, and Helen Clark, who wrote the foreword, and the designers and crowdfunders and all our clever friends who helped inform the book. And yeah, sorry, I don't want to finish an Oscar speech, self-awarded Oscar speech, but just I want to say hi, Mum. She's there in Wales somewhere. So the book, it's a really long, detailed book. It's about 304 pages, I think. And I've got like 7 minutes left to try and summarize it, which I'm obviously not going to be able to. There's a lot of detail in there. The devil is in the detail. So I really would encourage people to sort of dive in, to try and read it, absorb it, think about it, let us know what you think, talk about it, debate it. The whole point of this is to try and inform and promote discussion. I mean, we've made our proposals and the reasoning for them, and tried to provide some background and context. But we're putting it out there to try and get the debate moving. We're not expecting, we don't think we've got all the answers. And to a certain extent, we're just trying to ask the right questions. I am going to do a share screen, do some slides, if that is okay with folks, because no one wants to look at my face for much longer. Hang on a sec. Hopefully you can see that. Hurrah! There it is. This is the cover of the book, and yeah, just to go. Is that working? Come on. Oops, gone too far. Sorry. Yeah, firstly, just a few overarching aims and principles. I mean, it's always weird to have to even say this, but the sort of aims of the war on drugs and the sort of prohibitionist paradigm are so sort of weird and perverse. The idea that you will create a drug-free world, that we can use punishment to deter use and stop people using, and then we can use sort of enforcement, often militarized enforcement, to eradicate drug markets and to prevent drug supply. And the measures of success are all about seizures and arrests and so on. But I think it's worth reminding ourselves what we're actually trying to achieve with our drug policy here. And I'm not going to go through this with any detail, and a lot of these things have already been touched on by our brilliant speakers you've heard from already, but it's about things like human rights, public health, particularly protection of young and vulnerable populations. It's about social justice, ensuring equity, making sure populations who've been impacted by the war on drugs, whether it's people who use drugs or people who grow drugs or people who've been impacted by drug war-related violence, make sure that they are centred as we develop alternatives to the war on drugs, make sure that their interests are not marginalised. It's about issues of security and development, and we've heard from Thailand and Mexico and Colombia, and seen just how grim the outcomes of the war on drugs can be. Obviously, it's about crime reduction. Those are things we're trying to achieve. Those are things we're clearly not achieving with the war on drugs. And how do we do that? In terms of our overarching principles that have guided our work, we have a central idea of trying to minimise commercial profit incentives in any new regulated market. We've tried to learn from the failings and in some cases successes of alcohol and tobacco regulation, particularly the fact that we need to make sure that policy is not being driven by commercial profit motives and is driven by the need to deliver what I've just said, human rights, public health, and so on. And you'll see that reflected in our proposals. Policy needs to be science and evidence based. Again, it's weird to have to say that, but the war on drugs, it's anti-science, it's evidence averse. It's been driven by politics and ideology and a whole series of motives that have got nothing to do with public health at all, and by lies. And when you have policies driven by those things, inevitably it's going to be a disaster, as the war on drugs has. So we're all about the science and evidence. Regulation, just the concept of regulation as a way of managing and minimizing risks. Different drugs, different behaviors associated with different risks. So you use different regulatory tools in different ways. There's a menu of options, and it's not a one size fits all approach. And also it's not written in stone, unlike the war on drugs, which in many ways is written in stone. It's very sort of ideological and built around these very sharp moral binaries. We see evidence as evolving on the basis of evidence, and it needs to be flexible and able to change and respond to evidence of what's working and what's not. So just moving quickly on, in terms of the production of drugs, when we're talking about pharmaceutical preparations of amphetamines or MDMA or cocaine, it's useful to remind ourselves that these things already exist. These all already have legal production for medical uses. There is a legal cocaine market. People don't know a great deal about it. It does have some limited medical uses. There's a huge legal amphetamine market. There are literally billions of amphetamine pills are produced legally for medical uses every year already, and there is a very small, but it is nonetheless does exist, legal MDMA market for therapeutic use of MDMA. So we know how to produce these things to established pharmaceutical production standards. And essentially, in terms of the actual mechanics of production, all it means is expanding that production in a very similar way. The products that we'll be selling are pharmaceutical products, and they would be produced as pharmaceutical products would be, in fact, as pharmaceutical products of the same drugs already are. As we've heard from a number of the speakers, particularly in the Colombian example, there are some plant-based precursors for drugs, particularly the coca leaf. And we need to remember that on the production side of the precursors, we need to center sustainable development thinking. And we've heard from IDPC about their approaches to cannabis, and we've heard about the Colombian bill and looking after traditional indigenous coca producers. I'm not going to be able to talk about that because I just don't have the time, but there's a detailed chapter discussing that with lots of links to other work. But again, this is part of the social justice piece, that we need to center people who have been negatively impacted by the war on drugs, and make sure those interests aren't marginalized as we develop alternatives. The products themselves, these are some mock-ups we've done of the product packaging for potentially legally regulated cocaine, dexamphetamine, and MDMA. As you'll see, there's unbranded pharmaceutical style packaging. They would be child and tamper resistant. They'd have very clear product content labeling and dosage information. there'd be very prominent risk and harm reduction information. That's the sort of big yellow boxes there you can see. And there'll be directions to further information, things like websites or QR codes, so you could find out more if you wanted to. And we would also have information on inserts. And if you think these look a lot like pharmaceutical drugs, that's obviously that's very deliberate. They're unbranded. There's no kind of marketing. We want to make this as functional as possible to meet demand, but without actually promoting demand. So moving on, the vendors. We've proposed a state monopoly retail model where the government actually owns the retail, owns and manages the retail outlets. The reason for this is that basically we don't trust commercial interests. If you see what's happened with alcohol and tobacco, as I've already alluded to, there's clearly a tension between the interests of public health and the interests of profit-seeking corporations selling potentially risky drugs. We feel that a state monopoly retail model can potentially take that those dangerous commercial incentives out of the equation to a significant extent. And alongside that, we would obviously also have a total advertising and marketing ban similar to that we've seen with tobacco in many countries in recent years. We like the idea of a pharmacy-style retailer where you have trained individuals, a bit like pharmacists, who would act as a gatekeeper to access of the market. They would enforce a regulatory framework, things like age controls or intoxication of purchasers or any rationing controls, but they would also be specifically trained to give advice and required to give advice on risks, on harm reduction, and refer people to other information services or medical health services as appropriate. So, you know, pharmacies already can demonstrate a way of controlling access in a safe and effective way to a whole series of potentially risky drug products. So we're borrowing that idea and suggesting that you would have dedicated non-medical drug retail outlets run along the lines of a pharmacist model. There would also obviously be controls on location where the outlets could be based. Things like external signage and hours of opening, and some of this could be determined locally as opposed to under national legislation. We've already. It was really good to hear from Lorenzo about what's made it into the Columbia bill, because we do actually propose a three-tiered approach. A lot of drug policy at an international and domestic level at the moment is based on really outdated or completely inappropriate risk assessments. It's based on the pharmacology of the drug itself. In the case of cocaine, you have coca leaf, cocaine, and crack cocaine are all prohibited under the same schedules, both in international and many domestic laws. And whilst they are pharmacologically the same product, obviously they're vastly different in terms of their risks and behaviors associated with them. So we've talked about a three-tiered approach. What I've just described, the pharmacy model and state retailing, this would be for the pharmaceutical preparations, powder cocaine, MDMA pills, or dexamphetamine sulfate pills. And as Lorenzo alluded to in the Columbia bill for coca regulation, coca products, coca leaf, coca tea, and so on would be more commercially available, something more like energy drinks, coffee, chocolate, and so on. Whereas the very risky preparations, smoked preparations like crack or methamphetamine, we don't anticipate a retail model. We struggle to think how a retail model could really operate for those. So we've actually proposed, as Lorenzo touched upon, that you wouldn't criminalize people who use those drugs, but you would manage their use within a harm reduction framework. So you would have supervised consumption spaces for use. You would have service provision, treatment, and harm reduction, including options for substitute prescribing. And you would have appropriate levels of provision of support and wraparound care services, things like health services, mental health services, housing and employment support, that kind of thing. So again, it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. Different regulation models for different levels of risk and different drug products. So conscious of time, I'm going to stop there's loads and loads of other stuff I'd love to talk about, love to tell you about, and I think we're going to do a set of other webinars to explain some of those things. Drugs in the nighttime economy, drugs in development, drugs and harm reduction. So please do, download the book. It's free. We really want to hear what you think. You can buy print copies, but yes, we're trying to start a conversation. So take a look, read it, tell us what you think. If you rate it, share it with people, and help us promote this important, overlooked, and historically marginalized part of the drug policy and regulation debate. Thanks very much. Sorry, James, did I talk too long?
No, that's absolutely fine. Thank you so much, Steve. And just to reiterate your point there, we do want this to be the catalyst for a conversation about all of these issues. And so if you, as Steve said, if you agree, share. If you don't agree, say so. And let's get that discussion going. Absolutely. Okay, so it's now 10 past. I think we'll try and give maybe 15 minutes for questions, see how that goes. We've had a load of really good questions, so I'm going to try and get through them. I'm going to group them as much as I can so we can answer general questions that have been asked by a number of people. So I think the first question really that I'd like to put to the panel is, a number of people have asked questions around the issue of, given where we are with drug policy at the moment globally and in different countries, what does it take to shift the dial politically towards reform? So what are the political strategies that panelists think are the most effective in countering the political and public support for current drug policy? What are the approaches that work best? And what's your experience around that? And what thoughts do you have about that kind of strategic element? I don't know if anyone would like to put the hand up to go first. If not, I will randomly select a panelist from my screen. Okay, Lisa.
I knew it. I think our experience in working with you guys as well has been people are tired of hearing no's, but are actually willing to say yeses and hows. And I think that if at the moment there is not political will or a momentum to actually go and regulate all stimulants, people are eager to know what would that world would look like and how do we do it? Will it be safe? Will it be a controlled model? Will it have medical supervision? Will it increase demand? Like all the typical questions that we faced with cannabis reform, apply most of them to these particular substances, and people want to know exactly how to do it. So that's one thing, being more focused on hope-based communications rather than just opposing to prohibition and underlying the negative consequences of that. And the second thing is educating decision makers. Truly, when you have one decision maker like Lorenzo described, that knows exactly what it's like to fight the war on drugs and knows exactly what it's like to suffer the consequences of it, and then you have them really well trained, educated with the right tools, they can push the debate forward, even if it's just for the sake of educating public opinion and other decision makers. And lastly, we'll activate all the citizen tools that you have. Like in Mexico, we have this. I know in Colombia, you have tutelas, and then you have all other legal forms that you can advance tiny bits and pieces of drug policy reform through courts. There are other systems where it's impossible, but you have actually ballots, for example, in the United States, so you can actually activate citizen-led initiatives to try to move this forward. And I think that we've achieved massive progress over the past years, and we should try to build upon that.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Ray, can I ask you about that? Because obviously you're involved in the campaigning side of this. What's your kind of sense of, from your experience, what does and doesn't shift people's perspectives on this issue?
Yeah, talking to MPs, as we have done several times, we transform anyone's job. One of the interesting things that has always come across is that much as you can present people with policies and things like that, what actually gets through is people's personal stories. And the personal stories actually make an awful lot of difference to changing MPs' opinions and subsequently public opinions. And you know, I do think that while you've got all the policies going on in the background, you know, the individual stories, not just that I tell, but there are hundreds, there's thousands of them, does actually have an impact. And you know, that's why I do what I do. If I didn't think it had an impact and would change anything, you know, there wouldn't be any point. You can have all the policy changes that you want, you can have all the ideas, but you have to have a story behind the failed war on drugs and the impact it has on individuals and families and ultimately communities. Because, you know, somebody dies, it doesn't just affect the individual who's gone, it affects the family and it affects communities. And when you know most of these things are preventable, it really is quite a, you know, as far as I'm concerned, it's, you know, irresponsible, reprehensible. It can be changed. And we've got policies here, things that we know can work or could be at least implemented or tried. It's better than what we've got at the moment.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, and I think, you know, what you do is testament to that as well. Andrew, you wanted to come in on something around this question.
Yeah, thank you, James, and also just let me join all the speakers in just saying how amazing this book is. And as someone who works on drug policy, I feel I'm going to be citing, quoting, and plagiarizing lots of it in the next months, which is what I do all the time anyways. So on the issue of policy change, I just wanted to bring a different angle to it, which is that at IDPC, we do not work on a national level that much. We mostly work at UN level. And that's, of course, pretty important on drug policies because the drug conventions establish like the mandatory prohibition of certain substances, or scheduling of certain substances under national laws, right? And what we see at the UN, so the UN is such a prohibitionist, deeply prohibitionist environment that my experience there now is that many of these tools of engaging with stories, evidence, may not work because people who operate there are not receptive to it. And we see the hypocrisy of it in the current debates on cannabis, where many countries are voting against acknowledging the medical value of cannabis at the UN while they have in their own country medical cannabis programs. So they will not react to these tools. And I think that the only way to let's say like deeply reform or break the system is going to be from a bottom up pressure from national governments. And the force we have is that there are many, every country in the world is having this debate right now. The legal regulation debate on cannabis, coca leaf, cocaine, MDMA is happening everywhere in the global north, in the global south, and increasingly and slowly there will be more and more countries that will depart from this prohibitionist, evidence-less approach, and that's what I think we hope we're gonna be seeing in the next years.
Yeah, I think that's that really important point about the different levels of government that you need to work at, you know, from, you know, and how they interact is critical. Absolutely. Lorenzo, I'll come to you maybe on the next question, just because you need to crack on to. We've got lots of questions. There's another question which a few people have asked, which rolls around a lot. It's a very important one, which is in a legally regulated environment, and cannabis is the test case we need to look at for this. How do we realistically and meaningfully prevent the kind of corporate capture and the switch from an illicit, unregulated trade to a poorly regulated, corporatized, commercially driven model? What are panelists' thoughts on that? And Lorenzo, I'll come to you first on that, if that's okay.
Sure. We actually thought about that because in Colombia, medical cannabis is allowed, and we had that problem where like big Canadian transnational companies came in and took over the market. So in order to prevent that, in our proposal, we are restricting the cultivation of coca leaves to the current areas and to the current people that are growing, that is like indigenous communities and small farmers. So the idea is that by restricting the areas where you can grow, which are the areas that are further away from the big cities, that are the poorest areas, transnational companies will not be able to enter the market. So we are like kind of creating a barrier to entry for these transnational companies. There is also a social justice argument behind that, and it's that because of the war on drugs has mainly caused suffering on these people, these are the ones who should benefit from this new market. So it's both ways, like it's a social justice argument, but also it's like an economic argument to make sure that small farmers benefit. So by law, we will prevent the entry of these companies, at least at the cultivation stage. Later on, when it's about producing cocaine, transforming coca leaves to cocaine, that's a bit more difficult because it requires a bit more technology and sophistication. And about that, we think it should be on universities and research centers mainly to do that transformation.
Thank you. Can I come to Steve? Do you want to say anything on corporate capture and how we prevent that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I hopefully touched on it to a significant extent in our model. I mean, for us, we need to make sure that that there's a process issue here. That what you need to do is to make sure that at the early stage, the public health priorities and the mitigation against the risks of over-commercialization and corporate capture are hardwired into the legislation at the drafting stage. What you don't want to do is the experience that we've had with alcohol and tobacco, where you have an established highly commercialized industry that has a lot of money and lobbying power, and then you have to fight a kind of rear guard action to sort of retrofit the policy to remove those threats. So we think that that's particularly important for us to be talking about this stuff now. Now, obviously, a lot of the things that we're talking about with stimulant regulation in particular aren't going to be happening in the immediate future, but that's why we need to have this conversation now to make sure as we start to design and think about these things, we're making sure that mitigation is built in, because you can see the risks with cannabis. I mean, some places I think they've done a reasonably good job in mitigating against over-commercialization, corporate capture. Other places not so much. You know, the Mexican model of regulation, that battle is happening, you know, literally right now. I mean, the different interest groups are battling it out, and civil society, on the one hand, to a significant extent, is being outgunned by corporate forces. So the risks there are clear, but how we fight those risks is also clear. But we need to be doing that now. We need to make sure the right people are right around the table guiding that conversation. We need to bring them to the table now. That's why the Health Poverty Action webinar series that's running at the moment that looks at legalization regulation through a development lens is so important. I'd encourage everyone to make sure that they check in on that webinar series that's been running for the last few weeks and is running up to Christmas.
Yeah, and I think on that point, in terms of our model, just to say, you know, the idea of having a kind of state monopoly model, it's not unusual in alcohol, certainly, and historically has not been the case. So we have precedent for that approach, and you could say that actually the only reason why it's not more commonplace is because it's been resisted by already existing powerful commercial interests. And so it is really important, I think, in all these cases to get it in at the start and not be retrospectively trying to de-commercialize markets. But
I also think the state monopoly model that we're advocating goes a significant way to removing some of those risks, because I think it's at the retail point where those risks really manifest. And if the government public health agencies are in control of the retail point, I mean, there are risks obviously of state monopolies as well, but if we think it's probably the least worst option, and that's why we advocated it.
Adria or Lisa, do either of you want to come in on that one?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that the main fight that we're having with cannabis, with the cannabis bill that's being currently discussed at the Senate in Mexico is you need to ensure that growers, small farmers, communities are protected on the growing side, on the cultivation side. But you also need to ensure that they're active participants in the licensing model, that they actually have a time to adapt, that you don't put as many entry barriers for them as for just a few players to actually have the capital, the know-how, the technology, et cetera, that you need to actually be part of the legal market. And the second thing is, we also think that as an international movement, we should be knowing more about intellectual property rights and the battle of international trade, because what's happening with cannabis is that they're patenting some varieties. And so you will have some, strains of cannabis and some variations of cannabis that will be the intellectual property of some companies, and you won't be able to grow them or commercialize them without having to pay royalties for that. So it's just an extra step that we need to go and think about when we actually suggest or table some piece of legislation.
Very good point in those, and again, it's those things that sometimes sound very, very technical, IP issues, specificities of licensing costs and thresholds are actually where the action really happens, and I think that's one thing you need to bear in mind. Actually, did you want to come in on that at all from the IDPC's perspective on the responsible regulation stuff?
Yeah, I mean, of course. Just to add to what Steve and Lisa said, just looking at the experience of cannabis so far, I think that if you want to achieve an agenda of ambitious and real social justice in regulating drugs, you need very strong and very comprehensive political intervention and regulation. Any sort of laissez-faire approach is not going to do it, because money and companies have lots of power. Even countries like Colombia, who have tried and have been really innovative in trying to put a barrier towards the inflow of capital, it's not really working too much. And you will need, and this intervention has to be comprehensive, as Lisa said. So it's not only, it's in policy making, it's in lawmaking, it's in revising the impact of legislation, if it's guaranteeing access, it's really everywhere. So it's going to take lots of effort to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. We're running a bit short time. There's a couple of technical questions, which maybe for Steve here, I just want to kind of get through here. There's a couple of questions, some clarifications on the 3-tier approach and on the distinguishing between different risk factors. There's a question about separation between smokable and non-smokable forms of stimulants, and how we're defining risk in relation to mode of ingestion compared to dosage, and also one about the position of methamphetamine in the proposed regulation. Steve, I don't know if you want to just respond to those couple of questions.
Well, I mean, I can try to. I think the best thing I could do probably is to direct people to the book, so that otherwise I'll just ramble on for ages. But we felt that rather than focusing on pharmacology as the risk factor, we should focus on behaviors, because obviously frequency of use, dosage, the way people use drugs, whether drugs are being mixed with each other, using environments. These are the key factors that shape risk rather than pharmacology per se. So in broad terms, we wanted to focus on snorted cocaine or oral use of MDMA and amphetamines would be in the sort of pharmacy retail model. The much lower risk things like coca tea and chewed coca leaf or ephedra tea would be in a kind of relatively lightly regulated, like coffee or energy drinks. And we did, and with smokable methamphetamine or smokable cocaine, crack cocaine, or of course in cocaine prepared for an injection, it was hard to see how there would be a retail model for that. So we felt that was best managed within a harm reduction framework. Now, that doesn't mean that those things would not be supplied legally necessarily, but it might be that they would be a substitute prescription, so that there would be a non-smokable version, or an oral product, and oral amphetamines, for example, or even oral cocaine products. But for people who did continue to smoke or inject, you wouldn't just disregard them. You would maintain a supervised use, established harm reduction. There's a great chapter in the book on harm reduction. I can say that without self-aggrandizing, because it was very much closely borrowed, well, stolen, I think is a safe word, from the a brilliant report called Speed Limits by the Mainline Group in the Netherlands. So we do have a detailed discussion on what's known about stimulant harm reduction and what works. And that does include substitute prescribing and safe supply, discussions around safe supply. And of course, if you're making cocaine powder available, if people want to cook it up into crack and smoke it, obviously there's nothing you can do to stop that, but that doesn't mean you would necessarily make smokable crack available within the retail model. So there's quite a lot of nuance there. It is quite a difficult discussion, but we didn't see the kind of pharmacy retail model would work for smokable preparations, but we didn't want to, obviously, people who do use in higher risk ways, we wanted to cater for them as well, but we felt it was more appropriately within a sort of harm reduction framework. But do go and read the harm reduction chapter. Hopefully that will explain in more detail than I can do now.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. We are running, we are pretty much out of time. I just want to acknowledge there are a number of questions we haven't had time to answer. There's a good point about social justice access and different preparations, which we do. We try and address that in the book, and it is an issue that we need to acknowledge. And thank you for raising that. There's questions about links with environmental organisations. Again, unfortunately, we haven't got quite time to answer that now, but it's an important point about the relationship, what we're doing, and in the environmental movement and the climate justice movement. But we are at 9:30 in UK time, and I think we've taken as much from our panelists as is fair to do on an evening such as this. I just want to bring it to a close there. I just want to thank everyone again for attending on the panel. It is hugely appreciated. It's been fantastic. I want to thank everyone who's attended via Zoom. Please remember to, well, firstly, read the book, download it or buy it, or let's wave it around. Do the feedback. It's always a boring thing to say at the end, but as I say, very important. But thank you all for your questions. This chat has been amazing. The questions have been amazing. I'm so sorry we weren't able to answer all of them, but we will go back and reflect on those ourselves. Without any further ado, and with no more thank yous, but to everybody involved, I'd like to wish everyone a very good night, and hopefully see you all again before too long. Thank you, everybody.